So I'm going to ask Jason Child to come up on stage. Jason cut his teeth at Amazon in their finance department. He's the CFO of ARM Holdings. It feels like every other CFO came from Amazon and that army. He has held CFO roles at Groupon, Opendoor, Jawbone, most recently at Splunk. And he sits on the audit committee of e-commerce giant Coupang. In 2023, which probably feels like yesterday, he led the IPO for ARM at $50 billion, and no surprise, it's a $150 billion market cap, give or take, this past week.
It'll be higher today because NVIDIA's earnings.
We are just one NVIDIA miss from the market going away. Jason, thank you for joining us. Nelson and Jason, they're going to chat for a little bit and explore AI and all the fun stuff you've been doing at ARM. So thank you.
Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you. So, Jason, thank you very much. Pleasure to chat with you. Let's start with a few definitions. One of the things that I find is this is a world in which it is hard to keep up with all the changes that are happening. I feel like every day I get a new paper about a sort of new application. But I think one of the things that's happening is we are proliferating nomenclature at an enormously rapid rate, and I think we are adding a new adjective to AI on almost a daily basis. So it's generative, agentic, we could sort of go on. So for the audience, how do you think about the major buckets of what are out there in terms of artificial intelligence that would be, help people think about the landscape of what tools are possible for them?
Sure. So I try to keep it simple, and when I think about specifically in my role as CFO and what I'm trying to help my team and the company accomplish, I always first look at what is truly just automation, because a lot of what I see out there right now is probably more automation than AI. Then I think about what is machine learning, and then I think about what is actually AI. And my background in this is, I think as mentioned, I was at Amazon early on, and I joined in early '99, and I remember at that time I was blown away by this amazing online bookstore that could give me incredible recommendations. So it's like, these are so intelligent. I remember then going in the company and working with some of the engineers and say, this is so intelligent, and they'd be like, it's collaborative filtering. I was like, well, what is that? It's a machine learning algorithm that basically just says, look at everyone who bought, different products, and then figure out someone who bought this probably bought that. I was like, so that's not intelligence? They're like, no, it's just collaborative filtering. and people would be like, oh, this is genius. And it was like, no, it's just a lot of data. And if you feed a lot of data into a decent collaborative filtering algorithm, you get really, good results. But it basically says that most people who buy certain things start to look like each other, and that's it. So I kind of think about that very much as I watch what we're now calling intelligence, and I think a lot of what we're seeing is not quite intelligence yet. I think we're just seeing a lot of collaborative filtering, but I think there's a lot of promise. But I do think, as you mentioned a little bit in this last presentation, I think maybe we're not as far along as some people want to. When I hear things like super intelligence or whatever, I'm like, yeah, I think we're a ways away from that.
Yeah, so just to follow on that, so if you take the three buckets of pure automation, machine learning, and AI, can you give us just maybe a little peek under the hood about what's the difference between those three categories?
Yeah, so we're at a CFO conference, so I'll put it in a finance kind of lens. So right now, we of course, like I think everyone else's function, we're all trying to figure out how do we adopt and embrace all these technologies to try to, just get a lot more leverage on our existing resource. In other words, I'm sure we all have a goal, which is how do I not hire any people over the next budget cycle or whatever, and how do I instead use that that money instead deploy it to applications and technology that then allows me to get productivity and improvement. And so when you really step back, I look at a lot of the stuff, a lot of the plumbing, especially in the accounting world, a lot of that ends up being automation. So so my first question when I start getting proposals about wanting to go, usually it comes from someone who met a vendor that wants to sell an application, sorry if they're here, sell an application that's going to solve everything. And then, usually trying to understand, okay, well, first of all, how clean is your data? And do you even have the capability to do just basic like RPA, robotic process automation, comparing one spreadsheet to another or whatever, things that historically humans did, and we now found that with pretty good automation technology, you can basically solve a lot of those types of things. So I kind of first make sure how we got the automation done in hopefully relatively simple approaches and not overly complex. I don't want different apps for everything. I used to be in a company that sold software. I understand that is a business model for a lot of these companies, but I'm trying to make sure that I have a common set of clean data. And once you have that clean data that's been, I think that is clean, that's a whole different topic because that can take a lot of work. Then you can start to do the automation layer, you can do the machine learning, you can do a lot of different things. But I find that getting that clean data layer is really hard. So, for example, we all have ERPs. We all know that the fixed asset subledger to whatever goes into the GL, a lot of times there's issues there, even though I paid X millions of dollars to some company for this amazing cloud-based whatever tool, and you find out it's basically glorified Excel and garbage in, garbage out. So I think that's like certainly a core piece of really making sure you have clean data. I think as we then start to look at things like how do you use AI, in finance, everything we do is deterministic, and that is the number, there's a right or wrong answer. And it's fundamentally very different than how the LLMs are architected. LLMs are probabilistic. Finance is deterministic. There's an answer. The 8K or the 6K or 10K if you're in the US, 8K for me and international company. How do I make sure that all the numbers in there are exactly the right number? And if I'm going to use an LLM, it's going to give me the highest probability of what might be the right number, but it's not going to be exactly the right number. So I have to make sure I understand exactly how today's LLMs work and where I can trust it and where I can't. I kind of think of today's LLMs to me as mostly a first draft, but it can never be the answer. And so anyway, so that's generally kind of how we approach it.
Okay, great. One of the interesting things that's happening in my world, since I overlap a little bit with psychology and cognitive science, is it turns out the LLMs, a great segue, are actually a boon to cognitive scientists because you can run experiments on an LLM that you could never get through the human subjects committee to do on actual people. And so we're learning a lot about the human brain works. Nonetheless, I do think that humans and large language models are not exactly the same. And so I'm curious, as I sort of think back to work design and where we're going to put these technologies, how do you think about what are LLMs or other AI variants good at and what are human beings good at? Because I feel like that's kind of a necessary question to have then to figure out how we combine those two elements to get work done in the organization.
That's the question. And one of the, I'll say first, one of the most fascinating things I've seen recently is, and people may know this study, but Google DeepMind in the UK did a study where they took 15,000 ophthalmologists. They partnered with University College of London, and they basically did a 5-year study where they took 15,000 ophthalmologists and looked at their specific use case, which is diagnosing one of the kind of 50 retinal-oriented diseases that exist. And they basically, over a 5-year period, looked at these 15,000 physicians. They put them in control and treatment. They basically found that the ophthalmologists who used just their own approach and what they'd always done in their career, they found that they had about a 72% success rate in diagnosing one of these 50 retinal diseases. They then gave a group AI, and the doctors plus AI were 86% effective. They then had AI go alone with no one, and that was 95% effective. And so that's fascinating. It makes me wonder, okay, so to what extent is, whatever biases we, of course, Kahneman and Tversky helped us understand the gajillion biases that we all have. How do we make sure that we separate bias from, actually in this case, you could probably say it's like it's intelligence. I'd say maybe it's actually just collaborative filtering of a million dependent variables that the human brain probably can't completely all diagnose and assimilate at one time. In this case, the machine learning or AI is actually very, very helpful. So how do we figure out what are the applications or use cases where the AI can actually simulate more dependent variables than the human brain can, and it's probably better. But then when are there certain instances where the human brain can look at the robotics and understand that the robot shouldn't paint each other? It's pretty obvious it should be painting the car and not the robot, but somehow the algorithm just missed that. And so that is like clearly the challenge. How we get there is probably going to be a fascinating journey, but we'll see.
Yeah, just one follow-on question to that. I mean, one thing that I think about quite a bit is the current generation of the models tend to require a lot of data, like an enormous amount of data to be successful. There are many activities that happen in your organizations where there's enough repetition that we can imagine we could get a big sample size. Do you have any thoughts about what's going to happen for decisions that might happen a little farther up in the organization, in the C-suite, for example, where this might be a decision you only make a couple times a year or once a year, and will AI be helpful, or the broader suite of tools, the computational tools in that world? And are you using them in this way in any meaningful fashion?
To me, today's AI for me is really useful. Like a lot of people, in my team, I have a bunch of folks that are using AI to come up with forecasts where there's a lot of complications on how to forecast something. For example, in our business at ARM, we get about 60% of our revenue comes from royalties of technology we've sold. We actually get paid on about royalties on about 8 billion chips per quarter, which works out to about 61,000 chips per minute. It's a lot. And so every quarter we get the shipment reports of 8 billion chips across 500 partners and maybe 10 million different products. And so as you can imagine, that used to take a large team to forecast. With Excel would break, you'd have to use other tools. And so now that we're using AI to build these forecasts, well, the reality is it's really basically a Monte Carlo simulation for the most part. It's not, so it's really using the same approach that's been around for quite a while. It just might be able to be done a little faster and a little easier and a little lower cost, and maybe with a simpler application. But it's still going to give you a probabilistic answer. And so then the question is, how do you actually, try to then go make sure you can audit and inspect that data? And so what I'm finding now is actually our internal audit team is actually doing some really cool work by creating kind of some apps on how they're doing internal audit, where you're basically just trying to figure out ways, how do I go and pick the highest risk things that I should be looking at based on historical data? Where are things inherently more risky versus less risky based on a data-based approach? So things like that I think are kind of interesting.
Yeah, so it's a great segue. So just to link this back to some of my stuff, in that connect the human chain principle, one of the other things we talk about is making sure that amongst the chain that might go from the shop floor, broadly construed, all the way up to the C-suite, in a well-run organization, there's a set of rules for when problems get escalated to the next layer. Yep. And I think one of the ways that I conceptualize this is that the AI-related tools are going to be kind of the lowest layer on that human chain. And if you follow that logic, a lot of what humans are going to do is we're going to be in the business of exception management, right? Mm-hmm. Which is when the AI produces something that's nonsense or whatever, or it's a probabilistic answer, we need a deterministic one. Mm-hmm. I think that's going to require some very careful thought to figure out how do we train people to be exception managers, and how do we configure the technology environment so that they're using their finite resources to look at the wrong things. You gave us a nice example. I don't know if you have any other thoughts about where are there places or how to think about configuring the work so that we take full advantage of what humans have to offer in this context.
I don't know if I have an answer, but I will say it's a fascinating topic, and in particular, one of the topics is how do you hire right now? So are we done hiring? Is our white-collar jobs no longer, are we not employing undergrads or recent college grads? And there's been this whole concern that that's not going to happen. What's fascinating is actually I'm on a board of a company which has a really interesting group of board members, and we had a deep dive on AI 2 weeks ago, and we kind of looked at. One of the folks runs AI at Microsoft. Another one runs one of the unicorn kind of companies, and is a engineer from Stanford who's pretty sharp, and he's running a bunch of experiments at his company. And then we've got a couple. Anyways, so we kind of said, like, can everyone just share what are their learnings? And basically what they said was, in today's application of trying to say, let's go take AI and go solve a problem, they've generally all agreed that when you ask someone who is under 25, you get incredible creative approaches that are really mind-blowing and are pretty novel. If you ask anyone who's probably above 25, you basically have them trying to automate what they've always done, and it's not really very intelligent. And so it was kind of like, well, wait a sec, so that means maybe we are supposed to be hiring the younger folks.
Yeah, I just felt another gray hair sprouting, but
yeah, I am over 25. and so yeah, so then the question is there's obviously a challenge on how do you train the folks that probably have the intuition to know this is about judgment. And so the question is, does it change how the work is being done? Do you really have the younger generation really has to help build the plumbing and really help basically, kind of like in the old days, it used to be, when we went to, reporting used to be really manual. And then we all got Tableau, and there's now thousands of different reporting tools. And then pretty soon, we all had to go through this project annually or quarterly of how do you cull the 200 reports of which only 2 of them are useful. And how do we know which data is the right one and all that kind of stuff. So I kind of feel like we're kind of about to go through the same thing. Agentic AI is another example. Like there's so many apps that make it really easy to go create an app to go solve a problem. Now there's 300 agentic AI apps I see just in finance, and they all solve one particular problem, but they're really bad at solving a different problem. And so I don't know which one is the right app to use. And so now I've got too much junk, and I need to, And so I think this AI kind of cycle could be kind of like once we got automated reporting and all these great tools that just gave you more stuff, and then I started struggling with where's the information, where's the actual insight.
So let me ask a follow-on question, which I apologize is a little bit off script because I didn't think of this in advance, but you touched on something that I've been thinking about a lot, which is, and this may definitely sound like a gray-haired get off my lawn kind of comment, but one of the things I find is with many of our students at MIT, often, frankly, the large language models can write a more cohesive essay, with better grammar than the student could. But I have tried to get them to write the essay themselves first, and then, they can fix it only because, at least in my experience, having just written a book, right, forcing yourself to think through the arguments and writing it down, even if it's a little bit ugly in terms of style and grammar, my hypothesis is that's actually a really good mental exercise and you're building some skills along the way. And so I do wonder, clearly the under 25 crowd is going to have new skills that we don't have. Do we run any material risk of losing other skills that you got when the world was a little bit less automated? And we have another variant of this, which is at the business school, we teach students how you can do basic finance models or system dynamics models, knowing full well that most of them are not going to be professional modelers when they grow up. But I always justify this by saying, we want you to be educated, hard-nosed model consumers when you leave here. And you need to know a little bit about what's under the hood in order to ask the right questions. And I don't know if you've grappled with that question at all.
Yeah, but to me, it's a little bit of if you think about, I remember in the early days at Amazon, Jeff Bezos made everyone in the company had to read Mythical Man Month, and it was this famous book by some IBM programmers back in the 70s, and it basically went through the concept of one bad engineer writing sloppy code could wipe out the impacts of 10 good ones, and it basically was reinforcing, it went through, there's a bunch of topics, but one of the things it reinforced was the first principles thinking of trying to make sure you're engineering up front for the right outcome is critical. And so I feel like right now, I was actually at Dreamforce a few weeks ago, and Benioff was up there showing how amazing it was. You could have someone come up and create a chat or some bot to go solve some customer question or something, and you could do it on the fly, and it was incredible. And I watched it, and it just scared the crap out of me because I thought, oh my gosh, if someone's is creating like a bot every hour, I'm going to have thousands of bots just, and so the reality is like creating something quickly, I don't think is actually going to help us. Having someone who stops, thinks very clearly in a structured way of what's the problem I'm trying to solve, and then how can I actually build something that will scale beyond just solving that one problem, but actually solving something larger. That is the core skill set that I think is going to be so important in AI. And I think that skill set's always been important. I think it'll be even more important in this environment.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, this is a little bit of a comment, but one of the things I am now the faculty director for our leadership center is I think as a lot of the rote work is automated, actually the interpersonal skills, which we haven't really been talking about, are probably actually going to be more important in terms of communicating and dealing with conflict and so on. Maybe two more questions, and maybe we have time for an audience question. So I finished my remarks with a sort of purposely dark view with the analogy to the robots, welding each other's doors shut and so on and so forth. But I do worry, genuinely, having studied many innovations over many years, that the well-intentioned zeal to get these tools and technology out there does run the risk of collapsing under its own weight, in part because at least what I worry about is people get the cart and the horse in the wrong direction, right? Which is that they have a tool and they're looking for a problem. What's your kind of internal crystal ball for how is this going to go, and the companies that do well with it, right? What do you think are going to define their strategies for bringing these technologies into their organization?
I'd say I think it's early days. I'm an AI optimist. That said, to me, it reminds me of, one of the areas I find fascinating is genomics. And I remember, 2001, when Craig Ventnor, decoded the human genome and, basically went on the White House lawn and explained how we're going to eradicate all disease in 5 years. And then it turned out that we didn't actually have the compute processing to actually, the novel approach he had was shotgun theory. It basically was a way that could minimize the amount of compute necessary, which was great to solve it. But it was, in terms of actually trying to marry it to some sort of a genomic therapeutic, no way. Didn't have the processing power. And so now, 25 years later, we're 5 years away. I don't know. But I think we're actually starting to see things that are getting close. Obviously, mRNA vaccines are a great example. So I kind of feel like this AI thing's a little bit like that. We talk about how we're going to have AGI in 1, 2, or 3 years. Then we're going to have superintelligence and whatever. And I think the reality is you'll probably have intelligence in certain specific use cases, like helping an ophthalmologist try to figure out how should I diagnose something based on all these dependent variables. And so that'll be a great tool to aid an ophthalmologist, different than apparently they were doing it in London during the study, but to figure out how to actually use it. So I feel like that there's going to be stops and starts. And I think, I was at Amazon during the dot-com bubble and watched, everyone think that e-commerce was going to take over the world in 5 years. I would say 20-something years later, it's done exactly what they thought it would do. It just didn't do it in the same time frame. Yeah. So I imagine we're going to have a lot of the same similarities here.
Yeah. So last question for me. I imagine for many of the folks in this room that are on senior executive teams at their companies, they're getting pressure from their boards, if they have them, to articulate an AI strategy and start using this tool set. Any practical advice for them about what they might be doing in the next year or two to take advantage of this technology?
I would say, I think, as a CFO, it's always the same thing. Like, let's try some small use cases. Let's go prove the ROI before we just go all in and do the factory $50 billion spend and then find out it didn't work. So I think picking specific areas is probably the best approach. At ARM, we're actually now, I think we've deployed 2 million different jobs. We're basically, when you're basically determining, when you're writing an architecture or making advancements on an architecture, it's just a lot of put something out there, test it, figure out where it breaks, and then, and so that's, AI actually is really helpful. So we got 2 million jobs running right now at about a 90% accuracy. And so that's really, really helpful. We also, for fun, said, why don't we just put in, multi-petabytes of historic libraries, and let's go see if the AI can actually come up with a novel design. And the answer so far is, there's some interesting ideas, but it's far from, right now it's effectively the equivalent of the robots painting each other. And so it's like you would not use that, but it is helpful to kind of unlock some ideas. So I think as you think about like the board aspect, it's making sure you understand the whole probabilistic versus deterministic thing. You want to make sure that we're not putting all of our eggs into the AI basket, unless, of course, you're one of the hyperscalers who can afford to, and they're kind of in a special bucket. They can afford to do this. They can make these investments. They see how the world's going to transform for their businesses. I think the rest of us should probably not fast follow, maybe even slow follow. especially like in the finance function. I think it's a slower following approach is probably the best.
Yeah, I think that's great. And my version of that, one of the other things that I think comes out of the kinds of work I've done is there's an enormous amount of value that comes with just understanding how the work is actually done in your organizations. And I think at the level of the folks in this room, it's easy not to know that actually, because people don't always tell you the truth about, again, the duct tape and safety pins that they're using to hold the organization together. And it leads to a quote that I got from a former student that I've just been thinking about almost endlessly as this topic has come up. He's a senior leader at a major semiconductor company, and he often says, there are few ways to lose money faster than automating a process that you don't understand. And so if I was going to leave you with one thought, at least from my world, is make sure you understand how the work is actually done, warts and all, and then I think it will reveal opportunities to use the technology pretty quickly rather than sort of going the other direction. So it looks like Jeremy's about to give us the hook, or do we have time for a few questions?
Time for some questions. We have students with mics coming around. Are there any questions? If you raise your hand, we'll come to you swiftly. No questions? I figured Joe would ask a question, or anyone else? Oh, there we go, in back. There'll be someone running to you with a microphone. There we go, or.
I really liked Professor Repenning's statement about connecting the human chain, and I wonder if that includes telephone calls. That's what we used to use in the past. How do you think about picking up the phone and talking to people?
So it's a great question, and the way I think about it, and there's a whole field of communication studies that you can kind of build on here, but essentially the first thing that I want you to take away from this is that when you have to transfer ambiguous information or process that information, the fastest way to do that is to have a face-to-face conversation, right? And you all know this intuitively, because I'm sure everyone in the room has had a text message chain go horribly off the rails because of, a really basic misunderstanding. And in the book, I described this little example of where my spouse and I were flying to Tokyo, and we're going to meet at the airport, and we're texting back and forth, and we couldn't find each other. It turned out we were at 2 different airports, but it took like a half hour to get that sorted out. I think a video call would have revealed that much sooner. But the way I would suggest you think about it is you think about wiring that human chain together. There's kind of a hierarchy, right? Probably the best thing is what we're doing right now, face-to-face human chain. I think a video call, Zoom, is probably a pretty good substitute for that. It's not perfect, but it's close. When you get to voice, what the communication scholars will tell you is the bandwidth goes down a little bit just because your communication palette declines. You can't see me moving my hands around or my facial expressions, but that's still probably pretty good. I think when you get to email, text, IM, Slack, and all those variants, then I think you really are running a risk if you try to process ambiguity on those kinds of channels, because it's just not a well-designed technology for that. And as one symptom of that, which we have come across many times in our work design work, is if you find that a particular topic is generating dozens of emails or hundreds of Slack messages and tons of iteration, it's almost always a sign that there's a missing meeting in your process, right? That there is a juncture when you should just bring everybody together, have a well-designed meeting, 15 or 20 minutes, you can probably get more done than you would in hours of email. And when you take that approach, you can often take hundreds of emails a day out of your inbox, which I think not everybody would be happy with. So yeah, I think phone's pretty good, and I just would think of it in terms of a hierarchy and try to match that to the complexity of the conversation that you need to have.
Any other questions before we finish up? Okay, well, thank you so much, Jason, Nelson.
That's great, thank you.
Where do I get your book?
What?